The last thing anyone expected that August afternoon was for a boy to walk up to that microphone and change his entire life with one sentence. It was 1974, a county fair in northeastern Nebraska. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the biggest farmer in town sits in the front row because he paid for the front row, and where a poor kid from 160 acres on the edge of nowhere learns fast exactly where he stands. His name was Tommy Westcott. He was 17 years old. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. And he had a stutter so severe that some days saying his own name felt like trying to push a boulder through a keyhole. He stood backstage while other kids practiced their acts. A girl was going to yodel. A boy had a harmonica. Someone else was doing a magic trick with a handkerchief. Normal things, safe things, things that made sense at a county fair talent show. Tommy's hands were shaking, not because he was about to embarrass himself. He already knew that was going to happen. His hands were shaking because he had made a decision 3 weeks earlier, lying on his bed staring at the ceiling, and now the moment was here, and his whole body was screaming at him to walk out the back door and never look back. He didn't walk out. He walked up to that microphone instead. The crowd settled. 300 people, farmers and wives and children, and the kind of men who measure other people's worth in acres and equipment. Tommy gripped the microphone stand. He opened his mouth. "My name is Tommy Westcott." A few people shifted in their seats. A mother somewhere in the middle rows smiled with that particular kind of pity that feels worse than cruelty. "And I want to be an auctioneer." For exactly 1 second, there was silence. Then the laughter started. It didn't start mean. That's the worst part of this story. The laughter didn't start mean. It started confused, the way people laugh when they hear something so improbable that their brains just short-circuit. An auctioneer. The one profession on earth that requires a human being to speak faster and more fluently than almost any other. And the boy standing up there couldn't get through his own name. But confusion laughter becomes cruel, laughter the moment a rich man decides to make it cruel. Gerald Hutchkins was sitting in the front row. 6'3", 240 pounds, over 2,000 acres, his own bank, his own grain elevator, his own co-op, his own opinion of every single person in Madison County, Nebraska. And that opinion was tied directly to how useful they were to Gerald Hutchkins. He had a voice that could carry across a cornfield. He leaned back in his chair and he laughed. And then he said it loud enough for every single person in that tent to hear, "Son, that's the funniest damn thing I've heard all year. You might as well say you want to be a singing telegram." The tent exploded. Gerald's friends, the kind of friends that money buys, the kind that laugh when the rich man laughs and stop when he stops. They joined in first. Then other people. Then even some of the good people, the decent people. Because laughter is contagious, and the moment had turned, and nobody wanted to be the one not laughing. Tommy's mother, sitting in the third row, looked like she wanted to disappear into the wooden bleachers. His father, Earl Westcott, quiet man, hard-working man, a man who believed that most things in life didn't need saying. Earl sat perfectly still, jaw tight, eyes forward, saying nothing. And Tommy stood at that microphone while the laughter went on and on and on. Here is what most people would have done. They would have mumbled something, walked off, found a corner somewhere, and spent the rest of their lives making themselves small so nothing like this could ever happen again. They would have swallowed that dream down into a place where nobody could ever reach it. And they would have called it wisdom. They would have called it growing up. Tommy Westcott did not do that. When the laughter finally started to die, not because it was finished, but just because lungs need air, Tommy leaned into that microphone, and in a voice that barely cleared, the stutter that fought its way out one syllable at a time, he said, "I'm going to be the best auctioneer in Nebraska. And someday, Mr. Hotchkins, I'm going to sell something of yours." He walked off the stage. Behind him, the talent show moved on to the girl who could yodel. Nobody thought about Tommy Westcott's announcement after that. Nobody except 2 people. Tommy himself. and Gerald Hutchkins. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something about Tommy. Because this story only makes sense if you understand what he was carrying before he ever walked up to that microphone. Thomas. James Westcott was born in 1957 in Norfolk, Nebraska, only child. Father named Earl, who farmed 160 acres and worked part-time at the grain elevator to close the gap between what the land gave and what a family needed. Mother named Dorothy, who worked as a secretary at the county courthouse. Good people. Hard-working people. The kind of people who hold a county together without anyone ever noticing. Tommy started stuttering when he was 4 years old. The doctors said it happened sometimes. Many children grew out of it. Tommy didn't grow out of it. If anything, it grew into him, digging deeper roots the older he got, the more pressure he was under, the more people were watching. School was a kind of slow torture that you can only understand if you've lived it. Every time a teacher called on him, every time he had to read aloud from a textbook while 30 kids sat in rows watching him fight with his own voice. Every time he tried to answer a simple question, what is the capital of Nebraska? What year did the Civil War end? And the answer was right there in his head, perfectly clear, and his mouth just refused to release it. The other children learned quickly. Children always learn quickly. They would ask him questions on purpose, not because they wanted answers, because they wanted to watch him struggle. They would imitate the stutter behind his back and sometimes to his face. They would finish his sentences for him, the most humiliating kindness, or they would simply walk away while he was still trying to get the words out because their time was more valuable than his words. Tommy learned to be quiet. He learned to nod instead of answer, to point instead of ask, to keep his thoughts locked inside his head where nobody could mock them. He learned to become invisible. Except there was one place where Tommy Westcott came entirely, completely, unexpectedly, alive. The auction yard. His father started taking him to livestock auctions when he was 6 years old. Tommy would sit in the wooden bleachers, surrounded by men in work boots and weathered hats, farmers with soil under their fingernails and numbers running constantly through their heads, buyers leaning forward with that particular tension of people who know exactly what they want and exactly what they're willing to pay, and in the center of all of it, the auctioneer. Tommy couldn't explain what happened to him the first time he heard it. The chant, the rhythm. The way an auctioneer's words didn't fall out in normal speech patterns but moved like music, like something between language and percussion, faster than thought, hypnotic, a current you could follow with your ears even when you couldn't follow it with your brain. He sat there the first time and something inside him went completely still, the way a compass needle stops spinning when it finally finds north. He was 6 years old. He didn't have the words for what he was feeling, but he knew, the way children sometimes know things before they can explain them, that whatever was happening up at that podium was connected to something inside him. Here is what Tommy figured out, alone in his bedroom, practicing in front of a mirror when he was 9, 10, 11 years old. The auctioneers weren't talking. They were chanting, and chanting had a rhythm, and rhythm, the kind of deep, rolling, musical rhythm of auction chant, did something to his brain that normal speech didn't do. When he tried to talk, the words jammed. When he fell into the rhythm, 5, now 10, $10 bid, now. 15, 15, give me 15, and the words flowed. Not perfectly, not always, but enough. Like the rhythm created a back road around the blocked highway in his brain. He held onto this discovery the way a drowning man holds onto a rope. This was his thing, his secret. The one place where the stutter couldn't follow him all the way. And then, at 17, he made the decision to tell the world. The County Fair talent show was not an accident or an impulse. Tommy Westcott had spent months building up to that moment, practicing, preparing, deciding that if he was going to pursue this dream, he couldn't do it in secret forever. He had to say it out loud. He had to make it real. He just didn't expect Gerald Hutchkins to be sitting in the front row. After the talent show, Tommy went home and didn't speak to anyone for 3 days. His mother worried. His father gave him space. That was the thing about Earl Westcott. He understood that some things needed time before they needed words. On the fourth day, Earl knocked on his son's bedroom door and sat down on the edge of the bed. And he asked a question that was so simple, it cut straight through everything. "You still want to be an auctioneer?" Tommy didn't answer for a long moment. He thought about the laughter. He thought about Gerald Hutchkins's voice booming across that tent. He thought about the way 300 people had all found the same joke funny at the same second. "Everyone thinks it's stupid," Tommy finally said. Earl looked at his son. "I didn't ask what everyone thinks. I asked what you want." Earl looked at his son. "I didn't ask what everyone thinks. I asked what you want." There are moments in a life that hinge everything. Most of them are quiet. Most of them happen in small rooms with no audience. This was one of those moments. "Yes, sir," Tommy said. "I want to be an auctioneer." Earl nodded once, then he stood up. "Then we need to find you a school." Tommy found out two things in the next 5 minutes. First, there was a Missouri auction school in Kansas City that ran a 3-week intensive program. Second, it cost $400. $400 was most of a month's income for the Westcott family. $400 was the tractor. Repair they'd been putting off. $400 was Christmas and 3 birthdays and everything extra for the rest of the year. "Dad," Tommy started, "we can't. Let me worry about what we can afford." Earl was already moving toward the door. Then he stopped, turned around, and he said something that Tommy would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You got laughed at in front of the whole county. Most people, that would break them. You stood there and told Gerald Hutchkins you'd sell something of his someday." A rare, slow smile crossed Earl Westcott's weathered face. "That took guts, son. More guts than most men ever find." 2 weeks later, Tommy Westcott boarded a Greyhound bus to Kansas City, Missouri. He had $400 of his family's money in his jacket pocket. He was the most terrified he had ever been in his life. He was also, for the first time in as long as he could remember, going somewhere on purpose. The Missouri Auction School was housed in a converted warehouse near the stockyards. It smelled like cattle and sawdust and the particular kind of desperation that fills any room where people are trying to become something they aren't sure they can become. 30 students. Ages ranging from 17 to 55. All of them there to learn a craft most people thought was impossible to teach, working under a 62-year-old instructor named Virgil Clement, who had been calling auctions since 1936 and had a voice like a diesel engine wrapped in velvet. On the first day, every student had to step up to the practice podium and show what they had. When Tommy's turn came, he walked to the front of the room on legs that felt like water. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The block hit him like a wall. The familiar pile-up, words backed up behind an invisible barrier in his throat, pressure building, face going red, the other students starting to murmur. Someone whispered something that was definitely not kind. Tommy closed his eyes. He thought about the auction yard. He thought about being 6 years old in those wooden bleachers. He thought about the rhythm that had always been there waiting for him. And then he stopped trying to talk. He started to chant. 5, now 10. $10 bid, now 15. 15. Give me 15. Not perfect, not fast, but fluid. One word after another, carrying each other. The rhythm doing what the rhythm always did, making a road where there wasn't one. When he stopped, the room was silent. Virgil Clement walked up to the podium and looked at Tommy for a long moment. "How long you been stuttering, son?" "All my life, sir." "But you don't stutter when you chant." "No, sir. Not usually." Virgil was quiet. Then he said something that nobody in Tommy's life had ever said to him about his stutter. "That's not a problem. That's remarkable. Your brain found a workaround. All by itself. Something speech therapists spend years trying to teach." He turned to the rest of the class. "Pay attention, everybody. This young man is going to teach you something about determination, because I have never seen anyone want something this badly." Tommy Westcott was the worst student in class for the first week. By the second week, he was average. By graduation, 3 weeks later, he wasn't the best. But he had a certificate. He was officially, legally, professionally a licensed auctioneer. Now he just had to go home and prove it. What he found when he got back to Madison County was exactly what you would expect if you've ever met a man like Gerald Hutchkins. The world hadn't changed while Tommy was in Kansas City. Word had spread, of course it had, because in small Nebraska counties word always spreads, about the stuttering boy who'd gone to auction school. Most people thought it was sweet in a pitiful kind of way, like watching a three-legged dog try to run a race. Gerald Hutchkins thought it was an opportunity. Tommy's first job offer was a small estate sale, an old widow's household goods, nothing fancy. He'd called the auction house in Norfolk, explained his credentials, asked for a chance. The owner, Pete Dawson, had agreed. 2 days before the auction, Pete called back, "I'm sorry, son. I can't use you." Tommy's stomach dropped. "Why?" Gerald Hutchkins came by the office. Said if I let a stuttering kid embarrass himself at one of my auctions, he'd never do business with me again. And Gerald Hutchkins does a lot of business. That was the nature of Gerald's power. He didn't need to threaten violence. He didn't need to raise his voice. He just needed to walk into a room and say a sentence, and the math was obvious to everyone. Gerald's money versus a 17-year-old kid with a stutter and a certificate. Tommy hung up the phone and sat in his room, staring at the wall for an hour. He could have quit then. Nobody would have blamed him. In fact, most people would have called it wisdom. Instead, he looked up a phone number and went to knock on a door. Frank Oberlin was 71 years old in 1975. He had been calling auctions since 1929, starting from the back of a wagon with nothing but his voice and a wooden gavel. He had called auctions during the Depression, when families were selling everything they had just to eat. During the war, when men were gone and women ran the farms. During the boom years and the bust years and every year in between. 3 years. Earlier, a stroke had left his right side partially paralyzed. He could still talk, he could still think, but he couldn't stand at a podium for hours anymore. His career was finished. He spent his days in a small house on the edge of Norfolk, reading auction catalogues and listening to livestock reports and being bitter about it in the way that only truly great craftsmen can be bitter when their body takes their craft away from them. He opened the door and looked at Tommy Westcott. "I know who you are," Frank said. His voice was gruff, but not unkind. "The stuttering kid who wants to be an auctioneer. Gerald Hutchkins has been telling everyone about you." Tommy's heart sank. "Come inside," Frank said. "I want to hear you chant." For the next hour, Tommy performed everything he had. Frank sat in his armchair with his eyes closed, occasionally raising a hand. Again. Slower. "Where's your breath coming from?" When Tommy finished, Frank was quiet for a long time. "You know why auctioneering is hard?" he finally asked. Because it's fast." "No. Fast is easy once you practice. Auctioneering is hard because it's intimate. You're not just talking, you're reading people. You're watching their eyes, their hands, their body language. You're having a conversation with 50 people at once, and every single one of them thinks you're talking directly to them." Frank leaned forward in his chair. "Your stutter? It's not the problem you think it is. It might actually be an advantage." Tommy stared at him. "An advantage? People remember you. In a world full of auctioneers who all sound exactly the same, you're different. And when you don't stutter, when you hit that rhythm and the words flow, people notice. They think, that kid worked for this, and they root for you." Then Frank said something about Gerald Hutchkins that Tommy would turn over in his mind. "For years, Gerald is a bully with money. He's been one his whole life. His daddy was one before him. He thinks because he's rich, he gets to decide who succeeds and who fails." Frank's eyes went hard. "I've known men like Gerald for 50 years. You know what always happens to them eventually." "What?" "The bill comes due. It always does. The question is whether you'll be ready when it happens." Frank Oberlin took Tommy Westcott on as his apprentice that same day. For 3 years, Tommy learned everything the old man had spent 50 years accumulating. Not just the mechanics of auctioneering, the art of it, the psychology of a crowd, how to sense when a bidder had more to give and was pretending they didn't, how to speed up when excitement was building and slow down when attention was drifting, how to use silence as a tool, the pause before the hammer falls, that held an entire crowd in suspension. And every single day, alone in Frank's garage, Tommy practiced the chant until his voice was raw, until the rhythm was so deep in his body that it wasn't something he did. It was something he was. The day will come, Frank told him, when everything depends on your voice, when you're exhausted and emotional and the whole world is watching. On that day, the rhythm has to be so deep in your bones that nothing can shake it loose. Tommy believed him. He had to. What happened between 1978 and 1982 was a war. Not the kind with weapons. The kind that happens in small communities, where one man has enough money and enough connections to make another man's life quietly impossible. Gerald Hutchkins was thorough. He called in favors. He spread rumors. Nothing provable, nothing confrontational, just whispers in the right ears at the right times. He threatened farmers who were considering using Tommy's services with the casual offhand menace of a man who has never had to raise his voice to get what he wants. Use that stuttering kid and never get credit at my bank. Never get fair prices at my grain elevator. Never be welcome at my co-op. Some people caved. Tommy couldn't blame them. Gerald Hutchkins had real power, and real power meant real consequences. In rural Nebraska in the late 1970s, crossing the richest man in the county wasn't a risk most families could afford, but not everyone caved. Frank Oberlin had spent 50 years building something money couldn't buy. He had called auctions during drought years and foreclosure years and never taken more than was fair. He gave people time when they needed time. He spoke for them in rooms where they had no voice. That kind of life builds something invisible but unbreakable. When Frank stood at his final great auction in September 1978, 4 hours of flawless calling despite a failing body, and announced that Tommy Westcott would take over Oberlin Auction Services, dozens of families made a quiet decision. If they trusted Frank, they would trust the boy he believed in. Frank died 4 months later. January 1979. Tommy was at his bedside. "Don't let them beat you," Frank whispered. "And when Gerald Hutchkins's bill comes due, be ready." Tommy worked like a man possessed. He drove hundreds of miles for small auctions that barely covered gas. He practiced the chant until it lived in his bones. Slowly, auction by auction, his reputation grew. By 1980, he was the busiest auctioneer in the region, not because people felt sorry for him. That sympathy was gone. Because he was good. Because when he found the rhythm, the chant became hypnotic, a relentless flow of numbers and urgency that pulled bids higher and higher. In conversation, the stutter never left, but behind a microphone, it had no power, and Gerald Hutchkins was watching. Then the farm crisis came. The 1970s had encouraged farmers to expand, borrow more, grow bigger. Gerald had grown bigger than anyone. Land, equipment, loans. On paper, he was unstoppable. Then interest rates doubled. Land values collapsed. Grain prices fell. Farmers across Nebraska were drowning in debt. Gerald owed $2 million. His assets were worth half that. In March 1982, the Federal Land Bank filed foreclosure. An auction would be held. Someone would have to call it. The phone rang in Tommy's office. "Mr. Westcott, we're handling the Hutchkins foreclosure. We need an auctioneer." 2 others had declined. Gerald had warned them it would damage their careers. Tommy listened in silence. 8 years since the county fair. 8 years since the laughter. 8 years since he promised he would sell something of Gerald's one day. "I'll do it," Tommy said, "but I'll run it fair. No personal history. The market decides." "That's exactly what we hoped," the banker replied. On May 15, 1982, Tommy woke at 4 a.m. He put on his dark vest and white shirt, the uniform of his craft. He practiced in the mirror. 5, now 10, $10 bid, now 15. The T. Rhythm was steady. He arrived early and walked the land. 2,000 acres of rich Nebraska soil, rows of combines and tractors, a mansion-like farmhouse. Everything built by ambition and about to be sold. A truck pulled in. Gerald stepped out. He looked older, smaller somehow. "So," Gerald said, "the stuttering boy." "You must be enjoying this," Tommy answered carefully. "No, sir. I never wanted to see anyone lose their farm. I just wanted to do my job." Gerald laughed, bitter. "My job used to be running the biggest operation in Madison County. Now it's watching you sell it." "I'm sorry for what you're going through," Tommy said, "after everything I did to you." "Yes, sir. I know what it feels like. To be laughed at. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." For a moment, Gerald just looked at him. Something shifted. "You're a better man than I am," he said quietly. By 10 o'clock, 300 people had gathered. Tommy stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Hutchkins Estate Auction." Then he began. 20,000, 20, 20, now 25, 25, give me 25, no stutter, no hesitation, just rhythm. For 6 hours he worked the crowd. He read their eyes, their hands. He pushed and pulled with precision. Bids climbed beyond expectation. 6 hours of Gerald Hutchkins sitting in the front row, watching his empire dissolve piece by piece. When the final lot closed, the total exceeded projections. Creditors would be paid. Gerald would even walk away with something. Tommy stepped down, exhausted. Gerald approached. They stood face to face. 8 years between humiliation and reckoning, Gerald extended his hand. "That was the finest auction I've ever seen," he said. "You were professional." "I'm sorry it had to be yours," Tommy replied. "I'm not," Gerald said softly. "I was cruel to you." You answered with dignity. "I didn't know I was watching the bravest person I'd ever meet." He and his wife left Madison County soon after. Tommy never saw him again. What followed felt almost unreal. Tommy became the most successful auctioneer in Nebraska history. Over 4,000 auctions. Named Auctioneer of the Year 3 times. But success wasn't the legacy. Every year he ran free workshops for young people with speech impediments. He taught them rhythm, breathing, confidence. He created a scholarship in Frank Oberlin's name that sent hundreds to auction school. And every August, he returned to the county fair, not for recognition, to watch the youth talent show, to see if... There was another kid on stage, voice trembling, announcing a dream people didn't believe in. When he found one, he introduced himself. "My name is Tommy Westcott," he would say, still stuttering. And he would tell them, the things that make you different might be the things that make you great. The obstacles might be the path. And the people who laugh at your dreams, they may someday need you to save theirs. Tommy Westcott is 84 now. He still stutters. But give him a microphone, watch what happens. The rhythm takes over, and the boy who once stood in a tent full of laughter becomes proof that the last laugh is worth waiting for, even if it takes a lifetime.